The rain hammered against the windows of 1247 Maple Street that December night, each drop like a nail being driven into the coffin of everything Judith Thompson had ever believed about family. At 70 years old, she stood in the doorway of what had been her home for 43 years, watching her only son James load her entire life into 2 weathered suitcases. Her own son abandoned her at 70, but what she did next would shock everyone who thought they knew what an invisible old woman was capable of. Hello, beautiful souls. Tonight I want to share with you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about starting over, about the power that lies dormant within us, even in our darkest hours. This is about Judith Thompson, a woman who lost everything she thought mattered, only to discover that her greatest chapter was still waiting to be written. If this story moves you the way it moved me, please consider subscribing, because these are the stories that remind us of the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Now let me take you back to that rainy December night, when everything changed forever. Judith had spent the last 3 years of her life being the mother she'd always been, selfless, devoted, unwavering. After James's first wife, Patricia, died suddenly from cancer, Judith had stepped in without hesitation. She'd moved into his house on Maple Street, helping him navigate the impossible grief of single parenthood, while raising 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Michael. She'd packed school lunches with notes that said, "Grandma loves you," attended every soccer game and piano recital, and held James when he cried in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, wondering how he'd ever manage without Patricia. For 3 years, she'd been the glue holding their shattered family together. She'd watched James slowly heal, seen the children's laughter return, felt the house gradually transform from a mausoleum of grief back into a home filled with life. She'd thought they were building something beautiful together, a testament to how love could triumph over loss. Then Sarah arrived. Sarah was everything Patricia hadn't been: young, glamorous, ambitious. She swept into their lives like a hurricane in designer clothes, and James, still vulnerable from his grief, was completely captivated. Judith watched her son transform, saw how he straightened his shoulders when Sarah entered a room, how his eyes lit up in a way they hadn't since Patricia's death. At first, Judith was grateful. Her son deserved happiness again. But Sarah saw Judith as an obstacle to a new perfect life. The subtle comments began almost immediately. "James, don't you think the house would feel more spacious with just us? The children need to learn independence. They're too attached to Grandma. Honey, I love that you're so devoted to family, but we need to think about our future." The house that had once been filled with warmth began to feel cold. Sarah would reorganize Judith's kitchen, claiming she was helping, but really asserting dominance over what had been Judith's domain. She'd interrupt family dinners with phone calls that couldn't wait, slowly training James to prioritize her needs over the rhythms Judith had established with the children. She'd suggest activities that coincidentally excluded Judith. Date nights, weekend trips, family outings where Grandma would probably be more comfortable staying home. Judith watched it happening like a slow-motion car accident she was powerless to stop. She saw James's allegiance slowly shifting, witnessed how Sarah's influence was gradually erasing 3 years of shared grief, healing, and love. The man who had once held her hand and thanked her for saving his family was becoming someone she barely recognized, someone who avoided eye contact when Sarah made her pointed comments, someone who nodded along when his new wife suggested that maybe it's time for some changes around here. The children sensed it too. Emma, now 11, would climb into Judith's bed at night and whisper, "Grandma, why doesn't Daddy smile at you anymore?" Michael, at 9, had started having nightmares again, the same ones he'd had after his mother died. But when Judith tried to comfort him, Sarah would appear in the doorway with a tight smile and say, "I'll handle this. He needs to learn to come to his parents when he's upset." The final blow came on a Tuesday in November. Judith overheard Sarah on the phone with her sister, her voice carrying through the thin walls. "I can't stand it anymore, Karen. She's everywhere, watching everything, making James feel guilty if he doesn't include her. It's like living with a ghost who won't move on. I've given him an ultimatum. It's her or me. He has until the end of the month to decide." Judith's hands had trembled as she pressed herself against the wall, listening to the woman who had systematically dismantled her place in this family, deliver what amounted to her death sentence. But what broke her heart even more was the silence that followed. The absence of James's voice defending her, protecting her, choosing her. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house she'd helped hold together. The refrigerator's gentle hum reminded her of all the meals she'd prepared, all the birthday cakes baked with love. The creak of the floorboards above brought back memories of children's feet running to her room for comfort after bad dreams. Even the rattle of the old heating system felt like a heartbeat she'd helped keep alive. She thought about calling her sister Margaret in Phoenix, but Margaret had her own struggles, a husband with dementia and 2 grown children who barely visited. She considered reaching out to old friends, but realized how many relationships she'd let fade while pouring all her energy into rebuilding James's life. At 70, she'd become so focused on being needed by her family that she'd forgotten how to need anyone else. December arrived with unusual cold, and the tension in the house became unbearable. Sarah's smiles grew sharper, her comments more direct. "James, I saw a lovely senior community advertised in the paper. Maybe your mother would like a tour." James would nod noncommittally, but Judith noticed how he'd stopped meeting her eyes entirely. The children were confused and frightened by the change in atmosphere. Emma's grades began slipping at school. Michael started wetting the bed again. But when Judith tried to address their obvious distress, Sarah would intercede with false concern. "Oh, they're just adjusting to having a new mother figure. It's perfectly normal." Then came that December night, when everything she'd feared crystallized into reality. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the December cold into something that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there. Judith was in the kitchen, preparing what would unknowingly be her last family dinner in the house on Maple Street, when she heard James's key in the front door. But something was different about his footsteps, hesitant, heavy, like a man walking to his own execution. She dried her hands on the dish towel she'd embroidered 15 years ago, a small act of domesticity that suddenly felt monumental, and turned to greet him. But James couldn't look at her. His face was pale, drawn, and in his eyes she saw something that made her blood turn cold. The look of a man who had already made an impossible choice. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, and Judith felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This wasn't going to be a discussion. This wasn't even going to be an argument. This was going to be an ending. They sat at the kitchen table where she'd helped Emma with homework just that morning, where she'd made Michael laugh by making funny faces while he ate his cereal. The normalcy of the setting made what was about to happen feel surreal, like watching someone else's life implode while sitting safely in a theater. "Sarah and I are getting married in the spring," James began, his hands fidgeting with a coffee mug Judith had given him for Father's Day 3 years ago. "And we've decided that we need our space to build our new family without complications. Complications. That's what 43 years of being his mother had been reduced to. A complication. "James," Judith said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "This is my home too. I put half the down payment on this house when you and Patricia were struggling. I've lived here for 3 years. Where am I supposed to go?" He finally looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes not the son she'd raised, but a stranger wearing his face. "You can stay with Aunt Margaret for a while, or find a nice apartment. Mom, you're only 70. You're still young enough to start fresh." Start fresh. At 70, after giving up her own apartment, her own independence, her own life to help him rebuild his. "The house is in my name now, Mom. It has been since Patricia died. You remember? For tax purposes. Sarah thinks, we think it would be better if you weren't here when we start our marriage. It's nothing personal. It's just better this way." Nothing personal? As if 37 years of changing his diapers, teaching him to ride a bike, sitting up all night when he had pneumonia at 15, helping him through his divorce from his college girlfriend, celebrating every milestone, grieving every loss, as if none of that was personal. The rain outside grew heavier, and Judith found herself thinking about Noah's Ark, about floods that washed away entire worlds, about starting over when everything familiar had been destroyed. "When?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Tonight, Mom. Sarah, we think it's better to make a clean break, like pulling off a Band-Aid. Tonight, in the rain." At 70 years old, she was being evicted from her life with less notice than most people gave their tenants. The next hour passed in a blur of shock deficiency. James had already packed her belongings. 2 suitcases that somehow contained all the physical remnants of a life lived fully. Her photo albums, a few pieces of jewelry, some clothes, her mother's Bible, everything else. The furniture she'd contributed to the house, the dishes she'd collected over decades, the books she'd loved, the small treasures that make a house a home, would stay behind. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs as James loaded the suitcases into his car. "Grandma, where are you going?" Judith looked up at the child she'd helped raise, whose nightmares she'd chased away, whose scraped knees she'd kissed better, and felt something break inside her chest that she wasn't sure would ever heal. "I'm going on an adventure, sweetheart," she managed, though her voice cracked on the word, adventure. "When will you come back?" James appeared beside his daughter, his jaw tight. "Grandma is going to live somewhere else now, Em. But you'll still see her sometimes. Sometimes. Not every day, not for homework help or bedtime stories or Saturday morning pancakes. Sometimes." Michael emerged from his room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's happening? Why is everyone crying?" Because sometimes adults make choices that hurt everyone involved, Judith thought. Because sometimes love isn't enough to hold a family together. Because sometimes the people we die for are the ones who kill us slowly, one small betrayal at a time. But what she said was, "I love you both more than all the stars in the sky. Don't ever forget that." The drive to the Salvation Army shelter downtown passed in silence. James's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Judith could see tears streaming down his face in the reflection of the passenger window. Part of her wanted to comfort him. Old habits die hard. But a larger part of her was beginning to understand that this moment would define the rest of both their lives. The intake process at the shelter was humiliating in ways Judith had never imagined. Her ID, her medical history, her financial status, all of it reduced to boxes on a form filled out by a tired social worker who saw dozens of stories like hers every week. Elderly woman, abandoned by family, minimal resources, nowhere else to go. She was no longer Judith Thompson, devoted mother and grandmother. She was now a statistic, a problem to be managed, a number in an overburdened system. The shelter smelled of industrial disinfectant trying to mask the deeper odors of desperation and broken dreams. Her cot was in a room with 12 other women, and as she lay there that first night, listening to the symphony of snores, coughs, and muffled sobs, she felt herself becoming invisible in a way she'd never experienced before. At 70, Judith was learning that there was a special kind of invisibility reserved for elderly women, a social erasure so complete it was like being a ghost among the living. When she walked down the street, people looked through her. When she tried to ask for directions, voices became impatient. When she applied for jobs, applications were dismissed before she finished speaking. She had become part of the backdrop of other people's lives, as noticeable as wallpaper and about as valued. The first month at the shelter was an education in survival that no life experience had prepared her for. Judith learned to sleep lightly, protecting the few possessions she had left. She discovered which staff members were kind and which saw the residents as burdens to be managed. She figured out the unspoken hierarchies among the homeless, how the younger, more aggressive people got first access to everything, while the elderly were often left with the scraps. But the physical challenges were nothing compared to the psychological warfare she fought with herself every day. Each morning, she'd wake up for a split second forgetting where she was, reaching for the familiar comfort of her old routine. Then reality would crash down like a wave, leaving her gasping with the fresh pain of displacement. She'd lie on her thin mattress and replay every moment of the past 3 years, looking for signs she'd missed, warnings she should have heeded. Had she been too present in James's life? Too helpful? Had she somehow invited this betrayal by making herself indispensable? The questions tormented her during the long, sleepless nights. The shelter served breakfast from 6 to 8 a.m., and Judith would often find herself staring at the institutional scrambled eggs and wondering how her life had narrowed to this, measuring time by meal schedules and lights-out rules, sleeping in a room full of strangers, carrying everything she owned in a bag that never left her side. After breakfast, the residents were required to leave for the day unless they were sick or disabled. This meant Judith spent her days wandering the city, trying to make her small savings last as long as possible. She'd sit in the public library until closing, reading newspapers and watching the world continue without her. She'd walk through parks where she'd once taken Emma and Michael, feeling like a stranger in her own memories. The hunger was the worst part. Not just physical hunger, though that was constant. The shelter's portions were small and the next meal was never guaranteed. But there was a deeper hunger, a starvation of the soul that came from being completely disconnected from purpose, from meaning, from the sense that her existence mattered to anyone. She'd see mothers pushing strollers and remember the weight of baby James in her arms. She'd watch grandparents reading to children at the library and feel the phantom warmth of Emma curled against her side during bedtime stories. She'd pass restaurants and remember all the family dinners she'd cooked with love, all the birthday cakes she'd baked, all the ways she'd nourished the people she adored. Christmas approached with brutal efficiency. The shelter was decorated with sad tinsel and an artificial tree that looked like it had been donated by someone clearing out their garage. Judith watched other residents receive visits from family members, brief, uncomfortable encounters that still represented more connection than she had. On Christmas Eve, she called James. She hadn't planned to. Her fingers had simply dialed his number while her rational mind was distracted by a child's laughter echoing through the shelter's common room. "Hello?" His voice was cautious, like he'd been expecting this call and dreading it. "James, it's Mom." The word felt strange in her mouth now, like a title she no longer had the right to claim. Silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying. "How are the children?" she asked finally. They're adjusting. Emma asks about you sometimes." Sometimes? That word again, minimizing her importance, reducing her to an occasional thought. "I miss them," she said, and immediately regretted the vulnerability in her voice. "Mom, look, this isn't easy for any of us. But Sarah and we're building something new here. The kids are settling into their routine. It's better this way." "Better for whom?" she wanted to ask. Better for Sarah, certainly. Better for James's peace of mind, probably. But better for Emma, who used to crawl into her lap when she was scared. Better for Michael, who still sometimes called out for Grandma in the middle of the night. "I just wanted to wish you all a Merry Christmas," she said instead. "Merry Christmas, Mom." He hung up quickly, and Judith sat in the shelter's phone booth, listening to the dial tone and feeling something calcify in her chest. That was the moment she realized that waiting for her old life to return was killing her. That hoping James would realize his mistake and beg her to come home was a fantasy that was slowly poisoning her from the inside. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. January in the city was brutal. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous, especially for the elderly. Judith watched several of her fellow shelter residents succumb to pneumonia or hypothermia, their bodies simply unable to handle the stress of homelessness combined with winter weather. But something had shifted in Judith after that Christmas phone call. The part of her that had been waiting to be rescued, that had been hoping someone else would solve her problems, had died in that phone booth. What remained was something harder, more determined, and surprisingly resilient. She began to notice things she'd missed while drowning in self-pity. The way the other elderly residents were systematically ignored by younger people in line for services. The way women her age were sexually harassed by some of the male residents, with staff turning a blind eye because what did they expect? The way anyone over 60 was automatically assumed to be mentally incompetent, unable to make decisions about their own lives. She noticed Maria, a 73-year-old former school teacher whose son had stolen her Social Security checks and left her with nothing. She saw Robert, a 78-year-old veteran whose family had abandoned him when his PTSD became too much to handle. She met Dorothy, who'd spent 40 years caring for her disabled husband, only to be evicted by his children from the house she'd helped buy when he died. They were all invisible, all discarded, all written off by a society that had used up their productive years and now wanted them to disappear quietly. But Judith was beginning to understand that invisible didn't have to mean powerless. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small acts of rebellion against her invisibility. When she was ignored in the soup kitchen line, she spoke up louder. When a caseworker talked about her like she wasn't in the room, she demanded to be addressed directly. When younger residents tried to take her spot or her food, she held her ground with a steel that surprised everyone, including herself. But the real change began when she started paying attention to the children. They came with their homeless parents, kids of all ages who were experiencing their own version of displacement and abandonment. She saw how they tried to do homework in the chaos of the shelter, how they struggled to focus in school when they didn't know where they'd be sleeping each night, how they'd grown quiet and watchful in the way children do when their world becomes unpredictable. One evening in February, she was sitting in the common room when a 7-year-old girl approached her with a math worksheet. The child's mother was dealing with some crisis at the front desk, and the little girl looked lost and frustrated. "Can you help me?" the child asked, and something in Judith's chest awakened after months of dormancy. "Of course, sweetheart. What's your name?" "Lily." For the next hour, Judith helped Lily with her homework, and for the first time since being abandoned, she felt useful again. Not just useful, necessary. When Lily's mother found them hunched over the worksheet together, she nearly cried with relief. "I can't thank you enough," the young woman said. "I don't have the education to help her with this stuff, and she's been falling behind." That night, word spread through the shelter that there was someone who could help with homework. Within a week, Judith had a regular group of children who would find her every evening, bringing their schoolwork and their trust. Their parents, overwhelmed by the logistics of survival, were grateful beyond words to have someone who could provide this crucial support. But as Judith worked with these children, she began to see patterns that broke her heart. They were often hungry during homework time, their stomachs growling loud enough to interfere with concentration. They'd fall asleep over their books, exhausted from the stress of homelessness. They'd flinch when adults approached too quickly, having learned that safety was never guaranteed. She started using her small savings to buy granola bars and juice boxes, creating an informal snack program during homework hour. She established a quiet corner of the common room where children could focus, using her body as a barrier between them and the chaos around them. She advocated with shelter staff for better lighting and a regular schedule that wouldn't disrupt the children's study time. Slowly, she began to understand what was happening to her. The pain of her own abandonment was transforming into purpose. The anger at her invisibility was becoming a superpower that allowed her to see others who were being overlooked. The skills she developed as a mother and grandmother, the patience, the nurturing instincts, the ability to create safety in uncertain circumstances, weren't useless after all. They were exactly what these forgotten children needed. But it was Robert, the elderly veteran, who really opened her eyes to what was possible. Robert had been living on the streets for 3 years after his children stopped returning his calls. He had severe PTSD from Vietnam that manifested in nightmares and panic attacks. But he also had incredible practical skills from his military service. He could organize anything, fix almost any problem, and had the kind of leadership presence that people naturally followed. "You know what pisses me off the most?" he said to Judith one evening as they watched her makeshift homework group. "It's not that they threw us away. It's that they're wasting what we know. You think raising kids and running a household for 50 years doesn't teach you anything about logistics? You think surviving combat doesn't give you crisis management skills? We're not broken down old people. We're experienced human beings with decades of problem solving under our belts." Oh, that's when the idea began to form. What if the elderly homeless weren't just recipients of charity, but resources being wasted by a society too narrow-minded to recognize their value? What if their own experiences of abandonment and survival had prepared them to help others in ways that traditional social services couldn't? Judith started paying attention to the skills represented in the shelter's older population. Maria, the former teacher, could provide educational support. Robert could handle organization and logistics. Dorothy had nursing experience from caring for her husband. Frank, a 72-year-old former restaurant manager, understood food service better than anyone. They were all invisible to the outside world, but they were a wealth of untapped experience and knowledge. More importantly, they all understood firsthand what it felt like to be discarded, which gave them an empathy that couldn't be taught in any training program. The plan that began forming in Judith's mind was audacious in its simplicity. What if they stopped waiting for someone else to solve their problems and started solving them themselves? What if they took their combined experience, their shared understanding of abandonment and survival, and used it to create something that didn't exist? A support system designed by and for people society had written off. But plans and implementation were two different things, and Judith was about to learn that the distance between vision and reality is measured not in miles, but in the depth of one's determination to bridge it. March brought the kind of hope that only comes after surviving a brutal winter. As the city began to thaw, something was thawing inside Judith as well. A recognition that she wasn't the same woman who'd been abandoned on that rainy December night. That woman had been dependent on other people's love for her sense of worth. This woman was discovering that she had value that existed independent of anyone else's recognition. The turning point came when she overheard a conversation between two caseworkers in the shelter's administrative office. "We're losing funding for the children's programs again," one was saying. "The city council doesn't see homework help as essential services. What are we supposed to tell the parents? That their kids will just have to fall further behind? Tell them to find help somewhere else. We're already overextended." Judith stood outside that office for a long moment, feeling something crystallize inside her chest. The system wasn't going to save these children. The system wasn't designed to see their potential or understand their needs. The system saw them as problems to be managed, not people to be nurtured. But she saw them, and she was beginning to understand that seeing might be enough. That evening, she gathered her informal council, Robert, Maria, Dorothy, and Frank, in the corner of the common room where she'd been helping with homework. "I want to start something," she said without preamble. "Something that doesn't exist yet." They looked at her with the wariness of people who'd learned not to trust grand plans, but also with the desperate hope of those who had nothing left to lose. "The shelter's cutting the children's programs, but we don't need their programs. We have everything these kids need right here." She gestured to the group around her. "Maria, you're a better teacher than half the people working in schools today. Robert, you can organize anything and make it run efficiently. Dorothy, you understand how to care for people's basic needs. Frank, you know how to feed people with almost nothing." She paused, seeing something shift in their faces, a recognition of possibilities they'd forgotten they possessed. What if we stop being victims of other people's decisions and start making our own? What if we create our own program, our own space, our own way of helping these children and families? "With what money?" Robert asked, ever practical. "With what we have. I've got my social security, you've got yours. We pool our resources, find a small space we can afford, and start small. 1 meal a day. Homework help. A safe place for families to come when everywhere else has turned them away." Well, it was Maria who spoke the fear they were all feeling. What if we fail? Judith looked around at these people who had become her chosen family, these fellow survivors who understood what it meant to be thrown away and rediscover yourself in the wreckage. Then we fail together. But what if we don't? The next 2 months were a masterclass in determination overcoming obstacles. Finding a space they could afford meant looking at locations no one else wanted. A former restaurant in a rough neighborhood that had been sitting empty for months. The building had problems: unreliable electricity, temperamental plumbing, and a roof that leaked in 3 places. But the rent was something they could manage if they all contributed their social security checks, and the landlord was desperate enough to negotiate. Robert threw himself into the logistics with military precision, creating schedules and systems for everything from meal prep to cleanup duty. Maria developed educational programs that could work with children of different ages and skill levels. Dorothy researched health and safety requirements, making sure they could operate legally. Frank designed a kitchen operation that could serve nutritious meals on a shoestring budget. And Judith became the heart of it all, the one who held the vision when practical problems threatened to overwhelm them, the one who reminded them why they were doing this when exhaustion made them want to quit. They called it Mama Judith's Kitchen, though Judith protested the name at first. "I'm not anybody's mama anymore," she said, the old pain of abandonment still raw enough to surface unexpectedly. "Yes, you are," Dorothy said firmly. "You're all of ours, and you're going to be theirs too." Every child who walks through that door, every parent who needs to know their kid has a safe place to go, every person who's been thrown away and needs to remember they still have value. That's what mamas do. They create family where none existed before. The first day they opened, in May, only 3 children showed up, but they served them a hot meal, helped them with their homework, and sent them home with the knowledge that this place would be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Consistency, Judith was learning, was a revolutionary act when you were dealing with people whose lives had been defined by unpredictability. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. Parents started bringing children. Elderly people who had nowhere else to go found their way to the kitchen. Other homeless individuals discovered that this was a place where they could contribute, not just receive, where their skills and experiences were valued, where they could be part of the solution instead of just another problem to be managed. By the end of summer, they were serving 60 meals a day. By fall, they had a waiting list of volunteers, other invisible people who had discovered they had gifts to offer. By winter, they had expanded into the empty storefront next door. But growth brought new challenges, and Judith was about to face a test that would determine whether her vision could survive success. Success, Judith discovered, was more complicated than failure. When you're struggling just to survive, your goals are simple. Make it through another day, help one more person, keep the doors open. But when you start making a real difference, when your small operation begins attracting attention and affecting real change, suddenly everyone has an opinion about how you should be doing things. The first sign of trouble came in November, almost a year after Judith had been abandoned on that rainy night. A woman in an expensive suit walked into Mama Judith's kitchen during the afternoon homework session, introducing herself as Jennifer Walsh from the Department of Social Services. "I'm here to conduct an inspection," she announced, pulling out a clipboard and looking around the bustling space with obvious disapproval. "We've received reports that you're operating without proper licenses." Judith watched as this woman, young enough to be her daughter, examined their operation with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for crime scenes. She questioned their food handling procedures, their volunteer background checks, their educational qualifications. She made notes about the building's age, the mismatched furniture, the handmade decorations that gave the space warmth, but apparently didn't meet official standards. "Ma'am," Jennifer said to Judith with the particular condescension reserved for elderly women, "I need to see documentation that you're qualified to be running a program that serves children." "Qualified?" Judith repeated, feeling something dangerous stir in her chest. "Educational credentials, social work certification, nonprofit management experience. You can't just decide to start feeding people without proper oversight." Robert appeared at Judith's side, his military bearing automatically straightening her spine. "What qualifications did you need to abandon her in the first place?" he asked quietly, and Jennifer looked confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "The system you represent threw her away a year ago. Didn't require any qualifications for that. But now that she's succeeding where you failed, suddenly qualifications matter." The inspection continued for 2 hours, with Jennifer documenting every perceived shortcoming. The kitchen wasn't commercial grade. The educational materials weren't standardized. The volunteers hadn't been through official training programs. The building didn't meet accessibility standards. After she left, Judith sat in her small office, really just a converted storage closet, and read through the list of violations and requirements. To remain open, they would need thousands of dollars in upgrades, certifications, and legal fees. They would need to operate under the supervision of licensed social workers. They would need to standardize their programs to meet state guidelines, which would eliminate most of the personalized attention that made their approach effective. In short, they would need to become exactly like every other social service program that had failed the people they were trying to help. That night, after the last child had been picked up and the last dish washed, Judith gathered her core team around the battered table where so much hope had been nurtured over the past months. "They want to shut us down," she said simply, and watched their faces fall. "Can we fight it?" Maria asked. "With what lawyers? With what money?" Frank shook his head. "We're exactly what we've always been. Invisible people with no power." "No," Judith said, and there was something in her voice that made them all look at her more closely. "We're not invisible anymore. We've proven that. Look around you." She gestured to the walls covered with children's artwork, the thank you notes from parents, the photos of birthday celebrations and graduation parties they'd hosted for kids who'd never had anyone celebrate them before. A year ago, we were nothing. Throwaways. Statistics. Now we're feeding hundreds of people every month. We're helping kids pass their classes and graduate. We're giving elderly people a reason to get up in the morning. We're creating families where none existed before. That's not invisible. That's revolutionary. "So what do we do?" Dorothy asked. Judith smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached her eyes completely. "We do what we've always done. We take care of each other. But this time, we do it bigger." The next morning, she made a phone call that changed everything. "Channel 7 News? I have a story for you about some elderly people who are being harassed by the city for the crime of feeding hungry children." The news story aired on a slow Tuesday in December, exactly 1 year after Judith had been abandoned. The reporter, a young man named Marcus Chen, had initially been skeptical when she called. Stories about social service disputes weren't exactly ratings gold. But when he walked into Mama Judith's kitchen and saw what they'd built, his skepticism turned to amazement. The segment opened with footage of the afternoon homework session. Children bent over their books while elderly volunteers helped them with math and reading. The sound of patient voices explaining fractions and spelling, mixing with the gentle clatter of dinner preparation in the background. The camera captured something the bureaucrats had missed: the unmistakable atmosphere of a family. Marcus interviewed several parents who talked about how Mama Judith's kitchen had saved their children's academic careers. He spoke with elderly volunteers who explained how helping others had given them purpose after being discarded by society. And then he interviewed Judith herself. "Tell me about the woman who started all this," he said. His camera focused on her weathered hands as she stirred a pot of soup. "Her name is Judith Thompson," Robert answered from behind her. "And a year ago, her own son put her out on the street with 2 suitcases and told her she was a complication in his new life." The camera caught Judith's slight wince at the memory, but also the steel in her eyes as she continued stirring. "What would you say to the officials who want to shut this place down?" Marcus asked her directly. Judith looked up then, and the camera captured something that would replay on social media thousands of times over the next week. The face of a woman who had walked through hell and emerged with her compassion not only intact, but refined into something powerful. "I'd say they're welcome to come volunteer," she said quietly. "We can always use more people who want to help instead of just finding reasons why help can't be provided." The story aired at 6 p.m. and again at 11. By morning, Mama Judith's kitchen had received over 200 phone calls. By the end of the week, donations had poured in from across the country. Volunteers arrived from other cities, wanting to learn how to replicate their model. Food suppliers offered wholesale pricing. Local contractors volunteered to make the building upgrades for free. But the most important call came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh from Social Services called on Friday morning, her voice noticeably different from the authoritative tone she'd used during the inspection. "Mrs. Thompson, I wonder if we could meet to discuss a partnership rather than a shutdown." "A partnership?" Judith repeated, though she wasn't surprised. She'd seen this pattern before. Bureaucrats who opposed innovation suddenly discovering its value once it became popular. "We're interested in learning from your model. Perhaps we could work together to expand your services while ensuring compliance with regulations." Judith looked around the kitchen where Maria was leading a cooking class for teenagers, where Robert was teaching a military veteran how to organize a food pantry, where Dorothy was checking blood pressure for elderly volunteers who hadn't seen a healthcare provider in months. "Ms. Walsh," she said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but we've learned something important this year. The people who need help are often the best equipped to provide it. Your regulations assume that poor people, elderly people, homeless people are problems to be managed rather than resources to be utilized. We've built something different here." She paused, watching a 6-year-old help his grandmother read through a medication label, both of them learning from each other in ways no official program would have structured. "If you want to partner with us, you're welcome to come volunteer. Roll up your sleeves, serve some soup, help with homework. Learn why what we do works before you try to improve it. but we won't change our approach to fit your systems. We've seen where your systems lead, and we've chosen a different path." The conversation that followed would become legendary in social work circles. Jennifer Walsh did come to volunteer, and over several months she became one of their most effective advocates within the bureaucracy. She helped them navigate regulations while preserving their core approach. More importantly, she became one of many professionals who learned that sometimes the best solutions come from the people experiencing the problems, not the people administrating the responses. By the second anniversary of Judith's abandonment, Mama Judith's kitchen had become something neither she nor her team had originally envisioned, a model being replicated in dozens of cities across the country. Social work schools sent students to learn about their approach. Government officials visited to understand how they achieved better outcomes with fewer resources than traditional programs. But success on this scale brought challenges that tested everything Judith had learned about leadership, purpose, and the delicate balance between growth and mission. The hardest moment came when a wealthy foundation offered them a $1 million grant, enough to expand into a proper facility, hire professional staff, and serve thousands instead of hundreds. The catch was that they would need to professionalize their operations, which meant replacing most of their elderly volunteers with credentialed social workers and certified educators. The foundation representative, a polished woman named Catherine Morrison, explained the offer during a meeting in their expanded space. They now occupied the entire block with a commercial kitchen, a computer lab, and residential space for elderly volunteers who had nowhere else to live. "We love what you've built here," Catherine said. "But to really scale this impact, we need to ensure professional standards and sustainable systems. The volunteer model is heartwarming, but it's not replicable or reliable at scale." Judith listened to the presentation, watching her team's faces as Catherine explained how their organic, relationship-based approach would need to be systematized, standardized, and supervised by people with proper credentials. After Catherine left, the room fell silent. $1 million could help so many more people, but it would also fundamentally change what they were. "It's not about the money," Maria said finally. "It's about whether we trust what we've built or whether we think someone else could do it better." "The professionals had their chance with all of us," Robert added. "They threw us away. We took the people they couldn't help and we helped them. Now they want to take credit for our methods and push us aside again." Frank nodded toward the dining room, where the evening crowd was gathering. A mix of homeless individuals, low-income families, and elderly people who had found community and purpose after being discarded by society. "You see how Mr. Washington lights up when he's teaching kids about carpentry? How Mrs. Chen has stopped talking about suicide since she started helping with the food program? We're not just feeding bodies here. We're feeding souls, including our own." Dorothy, ever practical, voiced the fear they all felt. "But what if we're being selfish? What if we could help more people by taking their money and accepting their conditions?" Judith stood up and walked to the wall covered with letters from children, parents, and other elderly volunteers who had started similar programs in their own communities. Each letter represented not just gratitude, but proof that their approach worked precisely because it came from lived experience, rather than theoretical training. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," she said, "and I keep coming back to something Robert said when we started. They're wasting what we know. The foundation wants our results, but they don't want our people. They want to study our methods, but they don't want to trust our judgment. They want to scale our impact, but they want to remove the very thing that makes it work." She turned back to her team, these people who had become more than friends. They had become her chosen family, her partners in proving that discarded didn't mean worthless. "We say no to the grant, but we say yes to something bigger. We help other groups of elderly people, other communities start their own versions of this. Not franchises that have to follow our rules, but adaptations that fit their needs and use their strengths. We become teachers instead of administrators. We share what we've learned instead of trying to control how it's used." "And how do we fund that?" Frank asked. Judith smiled. "The same way we funded this. With what we have, with who we are, with the understanding that people who've survived being thrown away know things about resilience that can't be taught in graduate school." Over the next year, they developed what became known as the Mama Judith model. Not a rigid program, but a philosophy of empowerment that recognized abandoned elders as resources rather than burdens. They created a network of kitchens, community centers, and support programs run by and for people society had written off. The foundation eventually funded 17 of these programs, but without the requirement that they professionalize. Catherine Morrison had spent enough time volunteering in their kitchen to understand that their strength lay precisely in their refusal to separate helpers from those being helped. 3 years after that December night when her world collapsed, Judith stood in the commercial kitchen of their flagship location, supervising dinner prep for what had become a daily service for over 300 people. The space hummed with purposeful activity. Elderly volunteers chopping vegetables alongside teenagers learning job skills. Former homeless individuals training to become program coordinators in other cities. Families sharing meals and homework help in the dining room beyond. She was reviewing the supply list when Maria approached with an expression Judith recognized. The careful neutrality that preceded difficult news. "There's someone here to see you," Maria said quietly. In the front office, Judith felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that arrived before conscious thought. After 3 years, she knew this moment would come eventually. She just hadn't expected it to feel so much like déjà vu. James stood in her small office with his back to the door, studying the wall of photos that documented the growth of everything she'd built from nothing. He looked older, grayer, and when he turned to face her, she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Shame so deep it had become a physical weight. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like a teenager's. Judith closed the door behind her and took the seat behind her desk, the desk donated by a local business owner whose mother had been abandoned in a nursing home, the chair contributed by a furniture store owner who'd watched his own father die alone. Everything in this room had been given by people who understood abandonment from one side or the other. "How did you find me?" she asked, though she already knew. The news coverage, the social media presence, the speaking engagements she'd been doing at conferences, she hadn't exactly been hiding. "I've been following what you've done," James said, "for about 2 years now. I kept telling myself I was just checking to make sure you were okay. But really, I think I was trying to understand." He trailed off, struggling with words that had probably been rehearsing in his head for months. "Understand what?" Judith prompted gently. "How you became this person. How you went from what I put you through to this." He gestured toward the window that looked out on the dining room, where his own children's grandmother was now serving dinner to strangers with the kind of purposeful joy he remembered from his childhood. "I became the person I always was, James. I just had to remember her." The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of unspoken conversations. Judith found herself studying her son's face, looking for traces of the man she'd raised, the father she'd helped through his own crisis of abandonment when Patricia died. "Sarah left me," he said finally, 6 months ago. She said I was damaged goods, that I had too much baggage, too many complications." He laughed bitterly. "Complications. I remember using that word about you." Judith felt a familiar ache, not for her own old wounds, but for his pain. Even after everything, the maternal instinct to protect him from hurt remained. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Are you? After what I did to you?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm sorry you're in pain. I'm sorry you're learning what it feels like to be thrown away by someone you trusted. I'm sorry your children are experiencing the instability of divorce again. But James, I'm not sorry about the journey it put me on." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dining room where Robert was helping an 8-year-old with long division, where Dorothy was checking on an elderly man who'd been living in his car, where Frank was teaching a group of teenagers how to prep vegetables for tomorrow's lunch. "When you abandoned me, you thought you were choosing love over obligation. You thought Sarah represented freedom from the complicated history of grief and responsibility I represented. But what you were really doing was choosing fear over faith." She turned back to face him. "You were afraid that loving me meant sacrificing your chance at a new beginning. You were afraid that honoring our relationship meant limiting your future possibilities. So you discarded everything that felt heavy to make room for something that felt light." James's face crumpled. "And now I have nothing. Sarah's gone. The kids barely speak to me. Emma's at college and won't return my calls. Michael's angry all the time. The house feels like a mausoleum. I have exactly what I thought I wanted, complete freedom from complications. And it turns out that complications were the only things that made life worth living. Judith returned to her chair, her movements deliberate and calm. This conversation had been inevitable since the day she'd chosen to transform her abandonment into purpose rather than bitterness. "What do you want from me, James?" "I want," he struggled, looking around the office at the evidence of everything she'd built without him. "I want to know if it's possible to earn forgiveness for something unforgivable." The question hung in the air between them. Outside, the dinner rush was beginning, and Judith could hear the sounds of her chosen family taking care of each other and anyone else who walked through their doors. This was her life now, full, meaningful, built on a foundation of mutual support rather than biological obligation. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said quietly. "Not because you deserved it, but because carrying anger was preventing me from becoming who I needed to be." "But James, forgiveness and reconciliation are different things. Forgiveness is something I did for my own healing. Reconciliation is something we would have to build together, and it would require you to become someone I could trust again." "What would that look like?" he asked, leaning forward with desperate hope. Judith looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the man who had abandoned her, but the scared child who had never learned that love wasn't a zero-sum game, that caring for one person didn't require betraying another. "It would look like you learning what I learned, that people who've been thrown away know things about survival and community, that people who've never lost everything can't understand, that helping others heal our own wounds, that the best families aren't always the ones we're born into." She gestured toward the dining room again. "Everyone out there has a story like mine, abandoned, betrayed, written off by people who were supposed to love them, but instead of staying bitter, they chose to create something beautiful from their brokenness. That's what reconciliation would require from you. Not just saying you're sorry, but proving you understand what love actually means by how you treat people who can't do anything for you in return." James began volunteering at Mama Judith's kitchen the following Tuesday. Judith had made it clear that this wasn't about them rebuilding their relationship. It was about him learning to be the kind of person who could be trusted with relationships at all. He started with the most basic tasks: washing dishes, mopping floors, taking out garbage, the unglamorous work that kept everything else functioning. For the first few weeks, he was clumsy and uncertain, clearly uncomfortable in a space where his professional credentials meant nothing, and his past mistakes were irrelevant, only if his present actions proved his character. The elderly volunteers were polite but cautious, and the clients treated him with the wariness reserved for people who looked like they'd never missed a meal or slept in their car. But gradually, something began to shift. James started arriving earlier, staying later, asking questions that showed he was paying attention to more than just his assigned tasks. He noticed that Mr. Rodriguez always sat alone and began making a point of eating lunch with him. He observed that the after-school rush left Maria exhausted and started organizing the homework supplies in advance to make her job easier. Most importantly, he began to listen, really listen, to the stories of abandonment and recovery that surrounded him every day. He heard from Mrs. Patterson about being evicted from the nursing home where her son had placed her when she couldn't keep up with the rising fees. He learned about teenage Marcus, whose parents had kicked him out for being gay, and who was now sleeping at friends' houses while trying to finish high school. He sat with Vietnam veteran Charlie, who'd been living under a bridge for 2 years after his PTSD made him impossible to live with, according to his adult children. Each story was a mirror reflecting his own choices back at him, and the reflection was often brutal. But instead of running from the discomfort, James began to lean into it, using his own experience of abandonment by Sarah to develop genuine empathy for the people he was serving. The breakthrough came 4 months after he started volunteering, during the Christmas celebration that had become an annual tradition at the kitchen. Judith was coordinating a gift exchange for the children when 8-year-old Tommy approached James shyly. "Mr. James, do you have kids?" "I do," James answered carefully. "2 of them, but they're older now, and we don't talk much anymore." "Because you were mean to them?" The question was asked with the directness only children possess, cutting straight through adult pretense to the heart of the matter. "No, Tommy, Because I was mean to someone else they loved, and that hurt them too. Tommy considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd experienced enough adult complications to understand that family relationships were fragile. My daddy was mean to my mama, so she brought us here. But Mama Judith says people can change if they really want to. Do you think that's true? James asked. Tommy studied him for a moment, then nodded. I think you're changing. You used to look scared when you came here. Now you look like you belong. That night, after the celebration ended and the volunteers had finished cleaning up, Judith found James sitting alone in the dining room, staring at the photos of birthday parties, graduations, and holiday celebrations that covered one wall. Visual proof of all the family moments that had been created in this space. Tommy thinks I'm changing, he said without looking at her. Are you? James turned to face his mother then, and she saw something in his expression she recognized from her own journey. The look of someone who had discovered that rock bottom was actually a foundation. I'm learning that love isn't about possession. It's about wanting the best for someone even when that doesn't include you. I'm learning that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to show up for each other, especially when it's hard. He paused, looking around the space that had become a testament to chosen family and mutual support. I'm learning that the person I was when I abandoned you wasn't capable of the kind of love you deserved, but maybe the person I'm becoming might be. Judith felt tears in her eyes for the first time in months. Not tears of pain or anger, but the complex mixture of grief and hope that comes when something you'd given up for dead shows signs of new life. What do you want, James? Really want? Not just from me, but from your life. I want to earn back the right to be Emma and Michael's father. I want to learn how to love people without trying to control them. I want to understand what it means to build something meaningful instead of just consuming what other people create. He looked directly at her then, his eyes clear in a way she hadn't seen since he was a child. And I want to spend whatever time you're willing to give me learning how to be the kind of son who deserves a mother like you. The reconciliation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over months of shared work, honest conversations, and the slow rebuilding of trust that can only come from consistent actions over time. James continued volunteering, eventually becoming a coordinator for their job training program, using his business experience to help other people find stable employment. He began attending family therapy with a counselor who specialized in estrangement, working to understand the patterns that had led to his abandonment of the people he loved. Most importantly, he began the hard work of rebuilding relationships with Emma and Michael. It started with letters acknowledging his mistakes and asking for nothing in return. It continued with small gestures, sending care packages during Emma's senior year of college, attending Michael's baseball games even when his son ignored him. It was slow, painful work, with no guarantee of success, but it was the work of someone who had learned that love required effort, patience, and the willingness to be vulnerable. 5 years after that December night when everything fell apart, Judith Thompson stood at the podium of the National Conference on Aging, looking out at an audience of social workers, policymakers, and advocates who had come to hear about the revolution that had started in one abandoned woman's refusal to disappear quietly. The Mama Judith model had spread to over 200 communities across the country. Each program was different, adapted to local needs and resources, but all of them shared the same core principle, that people who had been discarded by society often possessed exactly the wisdom, experience, and compassion needed to help others heal from similar wounds. When my son abandoned me at 70, Judith said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, I thought my story was ending. I thought I had become irrelevant, invisible, used up. What I discovered instead was that my story was just beginning, and that sometimes the greatest gifts we have to offer the world only become clear to us after we've lost everything we thought defined us. She paused, looking out at faces that reflected every age, race, and background. People united by their commitment to seeing value in everyone, especially those society had written off. The elderly homeless veterans who now coordinate our crisis intervention programs understand trauma in ways that can't be taught in graduate school. The abandoned grandmothers who run our children's programs know about nurturing and resilience from decades of practice. The seniors who've survived financial disasters and health crises bring problem-solving skills and perspective that no amount of training can replicate. In the audience, she spotted James, who had taken vacation days to attend the conference. Next to him sat Emma, now a social work graduate student whose senior thesis had been about intergenerational trauma and healing. Michael, finishing his last year of high school, had started a chapter of Mama Judith's Kitchen at his school, focusing on supporting classmates dealing with family instability. The reconciliation had been imperfect, marked by setbacks and difficult conversations, but it was real. More importantly, it had grown from genuine transformation rather than mere apology. James had proven through years of consistent action that he'd learned the difference between loving someone and owning them. The children had learned that forgiveness was possible without forgetting, and that families could be rebuilt on stronger foundations after they'd been broken. But the most important thing I've learned, Judith continued, is that being thrown away isn't the end of your story unless you choose to make it the end. Every person in this room has the power to transform their pain into purpose, their abandonment into advocacy, their survival into service. The question isn't whether you're worthy of love and respect. You are. The question is whether you're brave enough to claim that worth and use it to lift up others who've forgotten theirs. After the presentation, as people filed out discussing implementation strategies and funding possibilities, Judith found herself surrounded by the people who had become her truest family: Robert, Maria, Dorothy, and Frank, all of whom now traveled with her to these conferences, sharing their expertise with communities ready to see elderly people as resources rather than burdens. "You know what I love most about all this?" Dorothy said, gesturing to the excited conversations happening throughout the lobby. 5 years ago, we were invisible. Now they can't shut us up. They laughed together, the easy laughter of people who'd survived the worst and found joy on the other side. Later, as they sat in the hotel restaurant sharing dinner and planning the next day's workshops, Judith reflected on the strange mathematics of abandonment and recovery. Being thrown away by the person she'd loved most had led her to find dozens of people to love and serve. Losing the home she'd lived in for decades had led her to create homes for hundreds of others. Becoming invisible to society had somehow made her more visible than she'd ever been in her conventional life. Her phone buzzed with a text from a stranger in Phoenix. "Mrs. Thompson, I saw your speech online. I'm 68, my daughter won't speak to me, and I've been thinking about ending it all. But maybe I could try your approach instead. Is there a way to get started?" Judith showed the message to her table and watched as 5 faces lit up with the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing your pain has become someone else's path to hope. "I'll call her tomorrow," Maria said. "I know people in Phoenix who can help her get started. And I'll send her the startup materials," Robert added, already making notes on his phone. As they planned this impromptu rescue mission for a woman they'd never met, Judith felt the familiar warmth that had replaced the cold abandonment of that December night 5 years ago. She'd learned that family wasn't about blood or obligation or convenience. It was about choosing, again and again, to show up for each other. It was about transforming your wounds into wisdom and your survival into service. Her son had abandoned her at 70, thinking he was choosing a simpler life. What he'd actually done was set her free to discover that her most important work had been waiting for her in the last chapters of her life, and that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romantic relationships, but about falling in love with the person you become when you refuse to let other people's limitations define your possibilities. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, and Judith watched it through the restaurant window while her chosen family planned their next mission of transformation. She thought about that scared, broken woman who'd lain in a shelter bed 5 years ago, wondering if her life had any meaning left. She wished she could go back and tell that woman what was waiting for her on the other side of her abandonment. Not just survival, but purpose beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Not just recovery, but the joy of helping others discover their own power to rise. But perhaps that was the message she was already sending. Every day, through every person they helped remember that being thrown away was just another word for being set free to become who you were always meant to be. And The snow continued to fall as 5 people who'd once been invisible planned their next act of revolution, proving once again that the most beautiful stories often begin with the words, "I thought it was over, but I was wrong."